You're listening to the Veteran Etc. podcast, as there's always more to be said about a veteran. Join your host, Mike Kim, a veteran, ex-monk, seasoned war trauma therapist, and writer, as he shares his years of research in veteran readjustment culture and the meaning of warrior life. Now, here's your host, Mike Kim.
Veteran Etc. This is a show based on examining and exploring the veteran reality, veteran daily lives, based on my concept of veteran readjustment culture going back to the 1990s. I've spent a lifetime looking at how veterans live, how veterans function in the world, how veterans produce books, magazines. How do they intersubjectively connect with the larger society? On this episode, I present an audio essay titled "The Woke Military: Myth versus Reality." Lately, there's been a lot of controversy regarding the U.S. military and its critics. You would think that the critics are some hippie flower children or some hipsters from Williamsburg, New York, as protesting the existence of the present military. But these days, it's more than that. It's more an issue of a protest coming from the right, ironically. And that protest is against a woke military. And basically, the criticism, this great grand scrutiny about the military these days is that the military is too woke, thus retention, thus recruitment is really difficult to establish in a fighting force today set up to deal with such complex conflicts in Asia and in Eastern Europe. I might say that the targeted areas around the world are all over, not just China and Russia as far as potential enemies. I think dealing with a 20-year war on terror that we just experienced, and also our long history of, let's face it, structured imperialism in the way we've set up bases throughout the world, even until this day, going back to the late 1800s, early 1900s. And this is something that was set up by, in many ways, well, Admiral Mahan's concepts and theory of demanding a maritime military naval power that would be roaming around the world and establishing security throughout the world. And that can be researched and verified as part of U.S. foreign policy. We've had gunboat diplomacy for ages. I would call fleet diplomacy, basically any problems that we feel are real, basically send the Marines, send the Navy, deploy them and resolve those problems. That's been our way in the United States to deal with complex problems throughout the world, and in many ways mirror what I mentioned earlier in regards to this shared imperialism. I might also say that we're dealing with a military right now that is integrated, but I would say not fully how could I say it? Deracialized. I could say integrated, but not fully, how could I say it? Still segregated and not desegregated. Why might I say that? I would say that just looking at simple numbers, when you look at the US Army and it's 9% officer corps, that's it. 9% of the US Army's officer corps as compared to, and that's 9% being African American. You've got 20% of the whole Army being African American. This is something that you can look up through the Carnegie Endowment of Peace. You can check the stats out in army.mil and in many other sources. You can find this information. Now, we've got politicians that, and let's just say I just gave you a simple statistic, but I don't go into the history, right, of many, many decades of racial discrimination towards African American soldiers, sailors, etc., as well as even in present day, how could I say it, situations that might create some type of controversy in regards to looking at racial diversity in the military, the latest reports regarding recruiting in poverty African American neighborhoods. That is one issue that has come up. I experienced that directly when I was on recruiting duty around 2009. And I was stopped and told by an African American school teacher not to enter the school simply because she had experienced many students go into the military and not receive the promises given to students from recruiters. Now, while the military has been a great place for advancement regarding Blacks and other minorities in the military, there have been instances of predatory recruitment practices from the military on urban public schools, probably also in rural schools, but I know from my readings as well as from my direct experiences, urban public schools. I have the case of someone I know who is a Korean American, never swam before in his life and was recruited into the Navy SEAL program and ended up quitting after the first day. I won't mention his name because that would be embarrassing. But not only that, I would say that there's a great sadness in that because I know of other Navy SEAL, what could I say, recruits who were given preparatory training prior to going through the BUDS program and were, what could I say, groomed on many levels for success and was not just sent to the program because of high test scores and, how could I say, meeting what I call an empty quota, a bogus quota. And so what happens with many people who talk about diversity in the military, they don't make that distinction between a bogus quota and a real quota. As the great Columbia University professor, Dr. Terence Maltiva, would say, everything in America is a quota. And he's right. Everything is quantified in America. Numbers are very important. And so it's a shame that when it comes to minorities in the military, it's frowned upon to talk about quotas. And I do what many don't do, and that's distinguish what is quota in the context of military. I gave you the case of the bogus quota with the Navy SEAL candidate that didn't make it through the SEAL pipeline. That's an example of a bogus quota. A real quota would be me. And this isn't to brag, but someone like myself who was enlisted in the military became an officer and used the military experience to pursue Ivy League education through the GI Bill, and also use all the leadership and management experience from the military to be successful in the civilian world, to receive well-paid positions in the private sector as well as in the public sector, to receive responsibilities, to, how could I say, solve complex problems, to be appointed into positions to resolve issues that, let's just say, others could not resolve or could not solve or could not settle. And again, this isn't something about bragging, but it's pointing out to the issue of a more authentic meritocracy, right? A more authentic meritocracy. I say that because Robert Berg's article in National Review magazine back in 2021, June 6th, to be specific, he talks about the military being a place of merit and how diversity and the woke military is just killing off the virtues of military life. Berg goes on to say, and again, these are my interpretations regarding the article. Go look it up yourself and study the article. And I'm sure you will come to certain conclusions where he basically, let's just say, selectively chooses parts of different military documents that encourage DEI. If you're familiar with the acronym, that's great. If not, know that DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's something that, ironically enough, the Army is being very vocal about these days. The military is vocal about it these days, but it has existed for years, going back to the days of Truman in 1948 with an integrated executive order. Back then, you had generals and admirals, some of them that were against, how could I say, the integration of African American as well as others of color into the military. And when you look at the Vietnam War, all the tensions of race in the Vietnam War led to a so-called woke general, or admiral, I should say, Admiral Zumwalt, to open up all the jobs in the military for people of color. Because at that time in the Navy, if you joined the Navy, and if you were of my color, if you were the color of Alex Haley, the great author of Roots, you would be put in a kitchen and you would be either given the rate, the job in your service within the Navy, a steward or a mess, part of the mess personnel. And basically you would be either a cook or you would be servicing officers. That's right. That's what your job would be. prior to Admiral Zumwalt's so-called woke actions in the military in the early 70s. This historically changed the military and opened up the Navy, the Marine Corps, and influenced the Army and Air Force to change its policies regarding the treatment of people of color in the military. And so it's important to recognize that wokeness isn't just the word, and it's just not a recent word. I mean, it goes back to one of my favorite blues musicians, and I would say one of the favorite musicians of Nirvana. Yes, the great Leadbelly. The great Leadbelly, the great blues guitarist Leadbelly, he included the term woke in one of his 1938 songs that involved a certain level of consciousness regarding the persecution of Black males in the South. His song was focused on the famous trial known to many as the Scottsboro Boys trial. You could look that history up and you will see how injustice did exist. And in many ways, they still do exist, because when you look at not just the issues regarding George Floyd, but you look at the different instances where certain groups have been targeted because of their racial background. During pandemic, Asians, I know within my neighborhood, I was attacked for being Asian. Luckily, due to my military background, I was able to push this person away from me. And I will say that it was not a white person who had attacked me, but still, it was, I think, inspired by the rhetoric from a former president of ours who was white and was preaching a certain type of message, indirect message towards Asians with the whole Kung flu pandemic and COVID-19. Do I judge? Do I condemn? I might distinguish. That's what I might do. And I distinguish everything because it's important to make distinctions about what is happening in the military right now. Because the recent Army report that claims to not, let's just say, reach the quota for recruitment of 60,000, right? There's like a 25% shortage of recruits. And when politicians like Dan Crenshaw and Tom Cotton and others criticize the military as being woke and being that wokeness as the main reason for the military not being able to meet its recruiting standards, I have much to say about all that. And that's the research. Let's go into the research. The report actually cites that maybe 5% have issues regarding wokeness, but there are other issues tied to people who were asked, I guess, aging from 16 to 28. I believe that was the target for the research study. And there were many issues tied to what the study showed, and that is basically the generation, especially the Generation Z, Generation Millennial, their concerns are more tied to not feeling safe in the military, being away from their family, not feeling that for military advancement, it'd be something that would be comparable to civilian advancement. I mean, let's face it, we do have record unemployment at this point, something like 3.6%. So it would be natural for folks to be pursuing jobs outside of the military. Historically, the military has been a place for employment and advancement. But as we see right now, we've got record unemployment. And though we have inflation, the younger people do not have large families as in other previous eras. We have mostly single people who are flexible, who are fluid, who are able to remain with their parents or grandparents from the Generation X as well as the baby boomer generation to receive supports that might not be out there for them out in the world. And so this is a reality that those politicians and writers who claim the military is a bastion of wokeness, a bastion of not looking at service as something very important. Let's just say that in the study, or let's just say some military personnel have said or have alluded to the generation that we have now being targeted for military service. They view the military as irrelevant to their lives. They respect the military, but the military is just irrelevant. And when I look at my life and my parents, they all experienced war. My father experienced war. Even my sister joined the military. My mother was a civilian and experienced war. My stepmother died due to Agent Orange from the Vietnam War. So the influence, and I grew up during the Cold War years. This generation was exposed to the war on terror, but it was a distant war on terror that was not really felt by and large by most. They were triggered in many ways due to 9/11, but let us just say that only 1% of less than 1% served in the military during this time of American warfare, this war on terror that was inspired by the 9/11 attacks. You might think that my message is a woke message. I would say, okay, but I would challenge you and say, can you understand that I am speaking about different realities and truths that exist right now, not in the military, but in our wider society? Diversity, equity, and inclusion is something that has already been embraced by corporate America, by government. And so if it's already established within government, of course, it's going to be a part of the US military. I think what the critics of DEI don't focus on is responsibility. They may speak about service and they may say that they might just focus so much on gosh, this generation is just so focused on being cared for. But again, I go back to the issue of responsibility, especially when you are an officer and you are chief petty officer or an NCO. You've got a responsibility in your service. It's not just a service. And your meritocracy must be true. It must not be a false, mythical understanding of meritocracy. How can I say that? I look at all the failures in the United States military in regards to leadership. And this is objective by looking at military history from the most critical thinkers within all the academies and military colleges, as well as higher institutions for military studies. They would all agree that was it true meritocracy when you look at the accomplishments of General Edward Ned Aldman during World War II and the Korean War? Failures. If you look at the serious failures, the loss of lives due to General Aldman in World War II, in Italy, as well as getting promoted and failing MacArthur as a general in the Korean War, and his problematic racist behavior towards African Americans, Asians, and Puerto Rican troops. General Custard and his arrogance in his tactical and strategic failures in the so-called Indian Wars after the Civil War. General Lloyd Fredendall, who in World War II failed in the Kasserine Path, failed and was found hiding somewhere far from his troops while his troops were being butchered in North Africa as the U.S. military was trying to create an opening in that theater of war. General Westmoreland in the Vietnam War. His destructive and I would say ethically challenged strategy of search and destroy operations were true failures in the Vietnam War. If we go back to the Civil War, all the failures in the Civil War within the Union Army, the generals, it's just an endless list of failures until we reach General Grant, who has a certain sense of mastery of warfare. And then God knows how many Confederate generals failed, including the greatest of all Confederate generals, Robert E. Lee. We've got stories of failure, and these aren't African American generals. These aren't Native American generals. These aren't women generals. These aren't Asian generals or Latino generals. They are white generals. What I would say is this, that failure can happen with any race in regards to the military. My issue is that I present more an issue of opportunity. And I question the military as far as saying what types of opportunities are being offered, truly being offered to advance the progression of maintaining white personnel in the military, at the same time, including others. And this is how I end things, because it's not as simple as just going with Piers Morgan and his comments about the one director who gets the Academy Award, the one minority female director who gets the Academy Award in 2021, right? Chloe Zhao. I mean, when you look at the numbers, just look at them. The numbers are not threatening as far as military personnel wanting to have better lives, and the military setting up accommodations for that to happen without surrendering standards. That's what I speak about in this essay. And it's not about, again, getting caught up with the term wokeness, but truly looking at what are the programs out there to truly serve all people who wear a uniform.
Veteran Etc. invites you to join us again with your host, Mike Kim, every Sunday. If the content from this podcast is informative to you, please share the podcast with others. Give a like and/or post something you learned from the episode on social media. If interested in other truly informative podcasts like Veteran Etc., check out cominghomewell.com for a listing of other veteran-based podcasts. Thank you for tuning in.